Hi, I'm Guillermo Campitelli, and I'm going to talk about 10 strategies that scientists use to conduct research. Okay, strategy number one is to reduce the complexity of the world to variables. So the world is very complex, a lot of things go on in the world, and it's very, very difficult to do science if we don't reduce that complexity somehow. So variables are things that characteristics of things that can take different values. For example, if the things that we are interested in are people, age could be a variable because that's a characteristic of people, and it can take different values. Well, age may be very important to study a phenomenon, but it is important to understand that the variable age is an abstraction and as a simplification of a complex thing. Like the age will tell us the structure of the brain of people, the connections that between neurons in the world that people have conducted, the maturity of the brain, the size of the body, etc., etc., etc. So age is a simplification of all these things. Now, this simplification allows us to do research. Without doing this simplification, we cannot actually do research because it is too much the complexity of the world that we, in order to take into account all the factors, we would never start doing any research. Okay, so this is an important factor, reducing complexity of the world into variables. The second strategy is to develop theoretical models of things that happen in the world or phenomena that occur in the world. And ideally, we develop mechanistic models. So models in which we determine the different structures and the connections of those structures and how those structures work. For example, if we were able to develop a model like the engine of a car in which we can identify very clearly different structures, how they connect and how they work based on the input they receive, like the petrol, electricity, and the driving. So that's an ideal thing, and we do have those mechanistic models in physics, in biology, biological sciences, and we do have that in psychology as well. But a lot of things, a lot of models that we develop in science, and a lot of them in psychology, are probabilistic causal models. So we don't have all the understanding of how, for example, the structure of the mind works. But we can see if we change the values of one variable, what effect would that have into another variable. So without knowing the mechanisms in place, we can know a lot about the world just by seeing the values of one variable, the values of another variable, and by changing through some intervention the values of one variable, how these affect the other variable. And all the models have to take into account that the relationship between these two variables that we are interested in may be affected by other variables. So we need to take that into account. So strategy 2 is develop theoretical models. The third strategy is to define populations. And in psychology, we are interested in people. But it's not the only population we are interested in. Sometimes we are interested in animals. So we need to define the population. But it may be the case that the research we are doing, it applies to all humans, but that's not necessarily the case. The population that we are interested in may be all people who have some characteristic, like for example, all people who are depressed, or people with some intellectual disability, or the other way around, gifted people. We may restrict our interest to people of one gender, or to a population of students. So we need to clarify and define clearly what's the population we are investigating. Now, this is the most important aspect in psychological research, but we also need to take into account that populations of objects and situations. For example, we investigate, in psycholinguistics, researchers investigate how fast people read words. Now, are we interested in all words, or does our specific research is interested in one subset of those words? For example, those words that are familiar to us, but not the ones that they are unfamiliar. So we need to define the population very clearly. Situation is another aspect. For example, we may be interested in doing research in situations in which we are reading words without no one looking at us. Or we may be interested in, if we do this, when we have an audience. So it may the relationship between variables may only apply to a subset of situations. Another type of situation, we may be doing research, and we do it in the morning, and we make a model of how variables interact, but our research is only in the morning. Maybe the relationship between variables changes if we do the research in the afternoon. So we need to, as much as we can, to define the populations of people, objects, and situations that we are investigating. Typically in psychology, we only define very well the people's populations, but not the objects and situations. Fourth strategy is to obtain representative samples. This is a very important issue, but it's also something that people with methodological background in psychology debate a lot. One of the things is that we need to obtain representative samples, but they shouldn't be representative in all aspects. Like, for example, let's say we are investigating a phenomenon in which gender is not important. So we expect that male and female would behave in the same way. So if that is the case, and it is very well established, then if the population we are interested in is all humans, and gender is not something that would affect the phenomenon we are investigating, then we don't need to have a sample that is representative in terms of having the same proportion of female and males that the population has. It has to be representative in aspects that are of importance in the phenomenon under investigation. The same applies to objects and situations. So if familiar words and unfamiliar words is an important aspect of the population of objects, so the familiarity of words is an important aspect the phenomenon that we are interested in, then we have to have a sample of words that represents well the distribution of familiar and unfamiliar words. Now, if that is not an important aspect, then we just use familiar or unfamiliar words. It depends on the type of research, the research question, what we are investigating. Okay, so strategy 5, plan efficient research designs. So we had the model of how variables are related. This is a probabilistic causal model. Now, and I mentioned before that there are unknown variables that we are not interested in that affect the variable under study. Let's say we are interested in how one type of psychotherapy reduces depression. Now, there are unknown variables that also may affect depression. So if we do a study in which we submit a group of people who are taking some antidepressant medication to therapy and a group of people who are not taking antidepressant medication to no therapy, so that's the variable A would be if they are participating in a psychotherapy session. And then we measure if reduction, how that after a while, if the depression reduced or is the same or is higher. Well, these two groups are different in two aspects: in the variable of interest, which is the psychotherapy, and another variable, which is the medication they are taking. So the effects that we find in our research, we don't know whether they are related to psychotherapy or to medication. So one type of design that helps is to do a randomized trial. So instead of putting the group of people with antidepressants in one group and the other with people with no antidepressants in the other group, we randomize. So we have a representative sample, and in that representative sample, we randomly allocate people into therapy or no therapy. So in that way, we sort of control the role of the unknown variables onto the variable that we are interested in. The 6th strategy is to choose appropriate statistical models. And you may think, well, we already talked about the probabilistic causal model. So what's the difference between the causal model and the statistical model? Well, I like to emphasize this difference because in psychological research, we tend to emphasize the statistical model. For example, you will see a lot of studies that they use regression design or ANOVA, analysis of variance design, or a t-test design. These are the statistical models. They are not the models of things that are going on in the world. So, for example, in this case, this is a fancy way of representing a regression model. Now, the parameters beta 0 is typically not very important, but it provides some important information. Parameter beta 1 is really important, is the parameter that we are interested in. But parameter sigma is not that important. So we typically call this parameter a nuisance parameter because we are not interested in. But we need this parameter, we need to estimate values of this parameter in the statistical model. But it's not important to understand the strengths of the relationship between variable A and variable B. Yes. So when we are thinking in terms of the causal model, how was the strength of the relationship between variable A and variable B, this parameter wouldn't be that important. So that's why this causal model and the statistical model should be different, because there are aspects of the model, of the statistical model, that they are there because they need to be there, because they follow a mathematical structure that is required to do the analysis, but is not useful in terms of how variables are related and what's the strength of those variables in the real world. Okay, so first define the causal model and then the statistical model. 7 strategies to collect data and with valid measurements. So basically we had first the design, and basically we know the values of these variables if it is a randomized trial, because we know that one value of variable A would be treatment and the other value would be no treatment. But the variable B is something that we are going to measure, and then we are going to obtain some distribution of values of variable B. Well, the methods that we use, the measurement tools we use, should be valid and reliable. Next, the 8th strategy is to make inferences from sample to population. So almost in all the research we do, we are not interested in the sample we collect. We are interested in the population from which this sample belongs. Why? Because let's say we are interested in how human memory works. Well, we don't have the time, the money, and it's even probably not ethical to measure all the people. We better use our time to do other type of research. But if we have a sample which is large enough, we can make estimations about how things work in the whole population. Now, this estimation will have some error because we are not measuring everyone, but we can establish some degree of confidence in our estimation of the population. So that's is very important. So one key aspect of this inference is that our sample is representative of the population in the aspects that are relevant to the phenomenon under investigation. So when that is the case, then our inferences will be more valid than when that is not the case. Strategy 9 is to update the theoretical model. So once we collect data and we analyze the data using a statistical model, then this information is fed into the probabilistic causal model. So maybe we have we established that the relationship between one variable and other variable was very strong. Now with new data, we can now see that it's not as strong as we thought it was. So we update the model. Or it could be even more radical. The new data may be saying that the previous model was completely wrong, that the strong relationship actually is very weak. So we need to change the model. Or we may find out that other variables are more important than the variable that we were interested in. So basically, we had a model, we start with a model, we do some research design based on that model, we collect data with valid instruments, we analyze it with a statistical model, and then we change the model if it is necessary. Sometimes it's not necessary to change, but we are going to improve it to make it more precise. Let's say we estimated that the strength of the effect of variable A on variable B was within some range. And now that we do new research, we can restrict that range, and we are adding precision to the model. So if the range was the possibility, the values were, let's say, from 2 to 5, now we do research and we can determine that the value that we are estimating is between 3 and 4. So we reduce the range of the possible values of the parameters that we want to estimate. Okay, so then what do we do? The TENS strategy is to use all the knowledge we acquire through doing research and start all over again. So we start updating the theoretical model, producing a research design and a statistical model to analyze the data. After collecting the data, we make statistical inference, and that makes us update the theoretical model. Now, maybe the model that we have in mind works for a specific population, so further research may try to extend the populations to which that model applies. So we studied in different types of populations, and that is science. Science doesn't stop, it continues to update its knowledge. So science is not characterized by have complete truths. Truth changes. The characteristic of science is to have objective methods, transparent methods, and based your statements about how things are work in the world based on evidence, data, and not based on faith. So these are the 10 strategies that scientists and in general, but specifically in psychology, use to conduct research.